Our next speaker is Will Hornblower. Will Hornblower is the high school history teacher, director of the parent education program, and a parent to Jack in the preschool and Maybelle in the 2nd grade. By the way, his kids are adorable. Please welcome Will.
Sorry, Carol's speech made me a little teary. I'm like... 7.5 years ago, I started my first day teaching at Oak Grove School. I had spent the summer lesson planning, figuring out how to adjust from teaching 40 students a class to teaching 12 to 16. I'd also spent considerable time reflecting on how I would adapt to teaching at a progressive school, especially at a Krishnamurti school. Personally, I agreed with the central tenets of the school's philosophy, but professionally I wasn't fully sure how to apply that philosophy to my teaching practice. So as my first class approached, I resorted to my graduate training, which said that a teacher must project authority, confidence, and always stick to the lesson plan. As the students filed in, I put on my game face, ready to show the kids that I was a force that should not be trifled with. When the students were seated, I said in my most stentorian voice, "My name is Mr. Will, and I'm going to start with my expectations for the class, which are extensive." I began rattling off my policies on tardiness, food in the classroom, punctuality, ad nauseum. Had I looked up from my notes, I might have noticed a bemused expression on my students' faces. However, my lecture was interrupted by a student who burst through the door with a haggard expression on his face. He announced, "I'm so sorry. I ran over a squirrel on my way to school, and I had to stop and think about that for a while." This stopped me in my tracks. I paused to consider how to proceed. My professional instincts and training urged me to continue with the lecture, knowing that one can only fit so much curriculum into my 171 days of teaching. Stick with the lesson, this part of my brain told me. However, another part of my brain started prodding me in another direction. This inquiring, curious part of my brain had atrophied in recent years, and it begged for some exercise. So I turned to the student. A small smile started to crack the facade of my game face, and I asked, "So after you hit that squirrel, what did you think about?" So I spent the first day of teaching U.S. history class, engaging in a free-ranging discussion on death, random chance, moral agency, and ethics. Krishnamurti writes, "Education in our schools is not only the acquisition of knowledge, but what is far more important, the awakening of intelligence, which will then utilize knowledge. It is never the other way around." Something awakened in me that first day. I suppose I could call it intelligence, and it profoundly changed the way I approach teaching and my relationship with my students. The culture of the school has a way of changing those who come into its orbit. However, we sometimes forget that this change is not limited to students. While our focus remains on the students, the magical thing about this place is its ability to awaken intelligence and to promote a culture of self-inquiry in the community of teachers, parents, alumni, and community members. In The Intent of Oak Grove School, Krishnamurti writes, "Academic excellence is absolutely necessary, but a school includes much more than that. It is a place where both the teacher and the taught explore not only the outer world, the world of knowledge, but also their own thinking, their own behavior." I had another moment of self-realization a few hundred miles east of Ojai, on the rim of the Grand Canyon. Each year I have the privilege of taking the junior class on a 10-day tour of the southwestern United States. We visit parks and wild spaces across Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, learning about the natural and human history of the region and soaking up the spectacular scenery. For the students, the trip is framed around building group cohesion, resiliency, and leadership. They have 10 days to disconnect with the electronic world and the pressures of academic life, and instead focus on building relationships with their class. For me, the trip is a chance to return to the many years I spent as an outdoor educator and to reconnect with the natural world. However, it is also 10 days apart from my family and the comforting routines of domestic life. On this particular trip, we had been challenged by unseasonably cold weather and rain. I'd announced the night before that I would be leading an early morning run to the canyon rim to watch the sunrise. However, when I reached for my shoes outside of my tent in the morning, they were covered by a few inches of fresh snow. Nonetheless, I persevered and slipped on my freezing shoes to keep my promise to the students. One student made it out of the warmth of her sleeping bag to accompany me on my run. As we ran through the forest path on the way to the rim, we experienced the wonderful stillness of a world covered by fresh snow. The reveal of the canyon at the end of the path caused us both to stop and marvel. The snow had stopped, but the clouds were still roiling with stormy energy. The sunrise was piercing the clouds and casting long shadows on the cliffs and spires below us. We'd arrived in the dark the previous evening, so this was the first time the student had seen the Grand Canyon, and I could tell it was having a profound effect on her. At that moment, I felt that adult urge to explain the scene to her. Use the teachable moment. Isn't this what we're told to do as parents and teachers? I wanted to make some sort of comment like, "Can you believe it's a mile to the bottom?" Or "You are seeing 1 billion years of geology in cross-section." But then I paused and reflected on why I wanted to interrupt the moment with an explanation. I wanted to be the authority in this moment. I wanted her to know that I knew more than she did. I wanted to be the teacher in this moment. But I didn't open my mouth. We simply stood there in silence, shivering as we watched the changing shadows in the canyon. We stood together as equals before the majesty of nature. So I wish to challenge you with this question. How has this school, this wonderful institution of learning, led you to consider and question your own ways of thinking, your own behavior?